Sepang 2015, well, 10 years. Where does the time go? We're still talking about it, but this is the definitive episode if you're wanting to kind of draw a conclusion from it from our side, just to give our thoughts on it, to reflect on it, and how it's still impacted MotoGP today. Yeah, it's crazy. 10 years have gone. We're all to different places at that time. Well, Pete was still at Christ, obviously, working away. Pete was there for the whole flyaway period in 2015, and yeah, has a lot of stories from it. Lewis, you were trying to start your career in this sport, and me personally, I was in my first year of my degree of broadcast journalism. Looked a lot different then. Had a lot less facial hair. You know, wasn't as tired as I feel now. But yeah, it's been a real journey. 10 years after, Marquez is a 9-time world champion. Valentino Rossi's retired. And it's all just still in the background. It's the taboo of MotoGP, which you can't talk about. And I think if you get, well, I think we're three sensible heads to talk about it, it can be really opened up. And yeah, Pete, I'll start with you straight away. 10 years since that weekend, well, maybe 2 weekends, you factor in Australia. What's your overriding feeling when you look back on it?
Yeah, just extremes of emotions, really. I think it was, as you say, coming from Australia, everyone was buzzing about the race that had gone on there. Nobody had any idea about anything that was going to be said at Sepang, shall we say. And the two title rivals, excuse me, are sort of, they're intersecting, aren't they? At sort of Valencia, Lorenzo's catching, and you can see that their paths are pretty much going to cross right on the Valencia finale. So Rossi comes into Sepang with a chance of winning the championship as well, which also adds a bit of extra spice. But it wasn't a normal title battle anyway, because everyone kind of knew that this was Rossi's last shot. You know, it was incredible that he was up there fighting with these two young guys. Marquez had dropped out of mathematical contention by then. But to do that at his age, you know, everyone knew it was his last shot. Normally when you see Pecco or Martin fighting in recent years, you think, well, they're both going to have more chances in the future, aren't they? You know, whoever wins it this year, maybe it'll be the other one's turn the following year. But everyone knew this was Rossi's, pretty much this was it. This was, his last chance. He'd done an incredible job of leading all of this way, but the pressure is building and building, the tension's building. At the same time, we're getting these fantastic races. And yeah, all the big talk coming in was really, are we going to get another race like Phillip Island? And that's what we were all hoping for. So yeah, we all land pretty bleary-eyed in Kuala Lumpur for Melbourne, and get greeted by the haze, which was also another sort of unusual thing, and questions about whether that could impact the race and things like that for visibility, the medical helicopter, blah blah blah. But anyway, all was fine with that, and then it's straight into the press conference.
Yeah, what a press conference it was. Liz, what do you remember? I mean, it's a long time ago, but it still feels so fresh, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's one of those moments that we talk about. It's almost historical. It's almost like a world history moment rather than a sporting moment. We sports full of these, but they don't seem to very often kind of almost supersede a sport, do they? You think of controversial moments in Formula One or in football or whatnot. People still talk about them, but they don't have this kind of almost oppressive sort of feel to them that the way Sepang does. And remembering at the time was, we just had this great championship battle, which we didn't have the previous year. Marquez dominated in his second year. We had a good one in 2013, all the way to the wire. So it was exciting from that front. It was exciting to see Rossi up there, given the years on the Ducati. A lot of questions there when he came back to Yamaha with, could he actually do it? He was runner-up in the championship the year before, but it was, that was an odd year where Lorenzo just kind of seemed to implode a little bit for whatever reason. There was kind of a lot of odd mistakes. But then to have these two, it was like 2009 again, Rossi versus Lorenzo, and it's like, wow, this is great. This is genuinely tuning in every week, excited to see what's happening. And then this really press conference turned sort of everything on its head, to the point now where all the merits of that championship, all of Rossi's great work to be in the fight, despite, as Pete says, his age, and experience, despite the great championship Lorenzo put on. I mean, people forget that Lorenzo, every time he won a race that season, he won 7 of them. They were start to finish dominant displays. Like, Lorenzo was arguably at his very best in 2015.
Yeah.
You know, those are all things that are forgotten about now. Even the championship victory itself is kind of overshadowed because of everything that transpired in Sepang and then in Valencia. And I don't think there's been a moment in MotoGP history either that's had such massive kind of ramifications on the series going forward. You think about the changes that were then made to the stewarding process afterwards, which was a bit knee-jerk. You look at, obviously, kind of really heralded the beginning and the end of Rossi's sort of time as a successful rider in MotoGP. You know, it ultimately led to Lorenzo making the move to Ducati, which then led to his move to Honda, which led to his premature retirement. Really, I think that's not unfair to say. And kind of pushed Marquez on to the level that he then showed from 2016 onwards, that kind of resilience and, desire to stamp his authority, I think really does stem from all that. And I think we still see the effects of Sepang 2015 to this day. The polarization in the fan base still exists, despite the fact it's been 10 years. If anything, it's gotten kind of worse, really. I think the incident in Indonesia is kind of proof of that. The backlash that Bezzecchi got, I do genuinely believe, is very much rooted in one side of the fan base's general dislike of the other one because of what happened 10 years ago in Sepang. And it has definitely made MotoGP, I feel, like a more bitter place, even to this day.
It's really valid point, Lewis. It does. It definitely does. And you think all the incidents in between Sepang 2015 to now, like you say, there's been so many bumps along the way. And I mean, at the peak of it, I don't mean to go off track, but I think the peak it ever reached was Argentina 2018. I think that was like almost the rebirth of it again. It was like the whole explosion of what obviously happened in that race. And it kind of never really got better for Marquez in terms of, it's just like, well, Luke was what he's clearly done, and Rossi had a second bite then to go at him, and it's just, that to me is still the lasting effect of it all, even though it's been settled. There's been so many things that came from the two weekends, and I think before we get into the press conference, it's important to look at why Rossi said what he said in the press conference, because we go back 1 week later, as you say, Phillip Island, arguably the best race of that season. It was incredible. Iannone, Marquez, Rossi, Lorenzo, four at the front, so many overtakes. And Marquez produces an unbelievable last lap to beat Jorge Lorenzo, effectively taking points off Valentino Rossi, but Rossi loses out to Andrea Iannone, who, we said before recording, gets a complete free run on this. No one even talks about him taking Rossi's podium away. But the key question is here, is Rossi right in pointing the finger at Marquez for the race tactics, which when I watched it back, I was really struggling to find what Marc did wrong?
Just to pick on what you said about Iannone getting a free run on it, actually at that time, that was what all the attention was on, really going into Sepang, was Iannone's going to get questions in the press conference. Sometimes what sort of questions riders are going to get. That was what we thought it would be, was Iannone, because he'd faced quite a backlash on social media from fans for that pass that you quite rightly bring up there, Jordan. So that was kind of the only, I suppose, negative aspect that anyone was aware of coming from the Phillip Island race. As you say, once you obviously hear Rossi's allegations, you look at the lap charts, and Marquez does, I think, about 4 slow laps, during the race. No, Marquez says, well, I'm just, it was the tire, I'm measuring it, measuring the wear, controlling it, all that kind of stuff. The bottom line is no one ever knows what a rider's intentions are, what's in their head. We can't do, but there's no doubt that he didn't break any rules in that race in Phillip Island. So that's all that matters, really. And I think it was hard to, I don't think anybody really saw that. I mean, there's still riders now after the allegations that will say what Marc was doing at Phillip Island wasn't normal. But I think, at the end of the day, you point out he passed Lorenzo, and that's the crucial moment for me, was that he overtook Lorenzo, because in all of this there's a lot of debate, speculation, who might have thought what, but it's the actions that count, isn't it? And by passing Lorenzo, he didn't need to. When we were preparing for this podcast, obviously, I think we all looked back at the races and everything else from 2015. And I was going to watch the whole of Phillip Island. And I thought, you know what? I just want to see that last lap pass that Marc does on Lorenzo. And I just wanted to check that Lorenzo didn't run wide or kind of gift him that place, And so Marc would have been forced to kind of pass him. Not at all. Marc makes that pass happen with 2 corners to go. He sets the fastest lap of the race and everything else. It shows what his speed potential was on that last lap. But I think Pedrosa's fastest lap was only 5 or 6 laps earlier. It was that kind of race. And that for me is the key, is that whatever Marc thinks, rightly or wrongly, his desire to win the race is greater than his desire to help Lorenzo. So, and what that means from Rossi's point of view is that if you're going to go for Marc or attack him, there is a risk it'll get worse, obviously, because if the same scenario comes up again, Marquez might choose not to overtake Lorenzo. So that's why it's not, we've almost been led to believe that it's, everything was being done to help Lorenzo. So therefore nothing worse could happen. But I just don't see that from what happened at Phillip Island. I think Marquez winning that race really is the decisive moment for me. And you can look, we've all done the amateur detectives and the lap times, but there's just no smoking gun either way, is there? I mean, it's just, unless you're on the bike with Marc, you don't know if he's losing the front or what. And sure, Iannone, but you mentioned Iannone sort of picked up on what Rossi says in the press conferences and says, Marc was playing with us because he was a bit slow out of some of the corners. But again, you don't know why Marc is slow out of the corners, do you? You don't know if that is genuinely to save the tyre or if he's trying to do something else. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because it's not against the rules. So, that for me is the main sort of takeaway from Phillip Island.
Yeah, and I went back and actually looked, because you said about Pedrosa's fastest lap, so that was the thing that I kind of looked at. Pedrosa finished 5th. He was 5 seconds off Marc. And that Honda, from what you hear the comments after, they were struggling with the front tyre temperature and trying to keep it. Because Marquez says he did have moments on the front, and maybe you said those 4 laps where they're quote-unquote slow. He's nurturing the tyre, isn't he? And I think, thinking back, it's 10 years since Bridgestones and stuff, and you think about how those tyres were in races, very different to the Michelins. So there's so many added factors into this. And I said to you before, Rossi shakes Marquez's hand after the race, no problem. The TV camera sees it. They go into turn 2 and they're just shake hands, and Rossi kind of gives a gesture that was good racing. I assume it's that was good. But there is the point after Lewis where Rossi gets back to the box, and whatever is said to him, he's immediately going, he's done what sort of thing? And this is where it changes.
Yeah, and I don't think that was the first time that had happened that season, because I think Danny Pedrosa had said some years later that after the battle in Aragon, where, they had a really hard battle for second, I think Pedrosa did say that Rossi came over to him, Parc Ferme, and asked him, were you deliberately trying to slow me up? And Pedrosa's like, what are you talking about, sort of thing. So I think, in hindsight, we look back on, okay, someone said something to Rossi. Clearly, from my kind of, my opinion is that this was something that had kind of already been brought up and it existed in his mind. And obviously there have been discussions within Yamaha before. Maybe they've gone, maybe, okay, well, if we bring this up again, then clearly, this is something that could potentially, work on our advantage. Maybe, well, if we bring this up and he points at Marquez, Marc will back off and, blah, 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 I don't know. But it was clearly a doubt that was in Rossi's mind before. And I think we look, and we'll discuss this as this podcast goes on, whether Rossi was right or wrong, whatever, and the way he's maintained his point of view about it. I think for me, what we really were beginning to see at that point was a rider questioning himself. Clearly the pressure was getting to Rossi because, as Pete said, this 2015 at the time we thought maybe Rossi would retire a couple of years later. We didn't know at the time he was going to go on until 2021. That just didn't really seem fathomable at the time. But at that point we thought, okay, this is probably the last opportunity. Marc's there, Lorenzo's there. That's a tough thing to maintain when you're in, what was he, 35 at the time, 34, something like that.
36,
so that's a hard thing to maintain, to keep doing that year after year after year. So we knew that was kind of the last point. It had been, ironically, 6 years since his last championship at that point, which, of course, Marquez won a championship this year, 6 years after his last. And, there had been the Ducati stuff. There had been, just a changing kind of era as well. When he came back to Yamaha, you had Pedrosa and Ross and Lorenzo kind of really getting into their stride as top riders. You had Marquez obviously rewriting the rule books. You had new riders like Iannone coming up, and there was, and MotoGP in general was getting more competitive. So the opportunities for Rossi were diminishing, and I just think all of that began to get to him, and it made the conspiracy thing a bit easier to work its way into his head, because if you're desperately trying to win a championship that you might never be able to do, or you won't be able to do again, and you're trying to do this, to make history, there's a lot of speculation that he was trying to do it to, because he really wanted to win a championship for Simoncelli, because he was involved in that incident, there was that horrible incident in 2011, and Simoncelli obviously being a great friend and really the first kind of VR46 kind of academy rider. I just think all of these things coalesced for Ross to just cast a lot of doubt on Rossi and put the pressure on him. And I actually think, looking back, as critical as I am of the way Rossi's handled this situation and continues to handle it, I do feel quite a lot of sadness about it, for the reasons I mentioned earlier about the fact it's minimised the great job he did anyway at that point, but also because he's continued to come across so negative and so bitter about it that it's just a sad thing, because really what we're seeing there is a rider that was just at the time full of so much pressure and doubt about himself, and it led to something that has irreparably stained his reputation. And as the further we get away from this incident as well, as we get a new fan base, a younger fan base, that as their entrance point to this championship is Marc Marquez. Yeah. And so I cannot tell you how many social media posts I see now of people bringing up Rossi clips, from that press conference, from the Italian media debrief after it, from that press conference a couple of years later where he refused to shake Marc's hands, from the Minio podcast, all these things of people going, this guy's a bit of a loser, which, obviously there's a kind of, they're not really thinking about history and whatever, but fundamentally, the further we get away from this, it only seems to alienate Rossi further to a fan base, and the perception of him has changed so much, and I think will continue to do so, particularly with Marquez doing what he's done now this year. And I just think of all the things to kind of tarnish your career over this, it's sad. Like, it's just a sad thing. I feel sad about it more than anything.
Yeah, I completely I like that point about the new fan base, the way they view him. And growing up, it was like, I always think that this moment is like the first time I ever seen Valentino Rossi show sort of, not vulnerability, just sort of like, what are you doing here? Because I knew how Marc Marquez was, and I'm quite lucky that I'm born in the time frame that I am to see both of them. And it's like, why are you picking on Marquez, sort of thing? And it's like, that's not the guy you go after. Like, because Marquez has nothing to lose. Pete said he's out of title battle. He's not even in it. But he's the element of the factor of the season. Mark's like the third person in it, but he almost feels like the second or first at times, because the struggles with the Honda, the flashpoints we get at Argentina, we get them at us, and it's always Marquez and Rossi. It's not Lorenzo and Rossi. It's never that. And I think, Pete, going to the press conference now, you're obviously standing there, and you see Rossi come in, you see Marquez come in, and it's a weird press conference, because we discussed it. It's like 25 minutes before anything's really even said, and like if there's a 25-minute press conference now, it's usually finished. Like, you don't really hear anything. But is Rossi saying this to get at Marquez and Lorenzo, hoping Lorenzo reacts from it too? Because obviously it affects him, because he's thinking, hang on, you saying me and him are in cahoots here, sort of thing? Or is Lorenzo going, happy days, he's thinking about Marquez?
I think Lorenzo was trying to work it out just like the rest of us, to be honest. I think you could see by his face. he was sort of unsure. Marc's reaction is to sort of laugh, isn't it? And he sort of laughs and he's a bit sort of nervous because he doesn't quite know what's going on, but he seems to think it's some sort of...
Yeah.
He seems to think it's some sort of joke, doesn't he? And he's sort of, okay, and he's all smiling, whereas Lorenzo was a bit more cautious, because I think Lorenzo was expecting something at some stage. As you say, they hadn't really had a big flare-up. There have been a few little moments of tension, the penalty point in Misano, that kind of thing, but nothing big. They certainly had much bigger bust-ups in the past, but, actually then Lorenzo knew how to use the sort of off-track mental side as well. He'd learned that from Rossi. So there was an element of, surely at some stage something will happen, and Rossi will try and play a few mind games off track or something like that. And then, as you say, the press conference is strange because they do their normal part where they're each guaranteed to speak, aren't they, to Nick Harris, who was doing it then. And nothing is said about any kind of, obviously the Phillip Island race is brought up because it was only 5 days previously, but nothing is said about any problem between Rossi, Marquez, anything going on, and then we get quite deep into the sort of the question and answer part, and then it's the question about what the chances of seeing a repeat of it this weekend, isn't it? I think they're asked. And Rossi sort of hesitates and just checks that he should answer first, which is also a bit strange because kind of the world championship leader always answers first when it's a group question. That's how it is. But he sort of checks and he pauses, and this isn't just a blurt out reaction sort of statement, is it? It's all very okay. I'm going to say this, and then he sort of in stages quite carefully says, these words are basically laying it out that he thinks that Marquez was helping Lorenzo in Australia, and saying that Jorge has a new supporter, and that is Marc, and sort of and points to him, doesn't he, just to absolutely emphasize it. And we all whoa, where did that come from? And from where I was stood, because I was stood and most people were sat down, I can see everybody in front of me, and the reps on the press office immediately bolt upright, straining to hear, what did he just say? It was one of those moments, and nobody, I think, saw it coming. Maybe there were some people that knew that something was going to happen, but I think for most of us, no, it came as a surprise, especially so late in the press conference. When there's no guarantee you'll even be asked a question. So what would have happened then? Would Rossi have just waited till he spoke to the Italian media afterwards? Probably. But maybe he just took the opportunity of that question to say, no, I'm going to do it in front of the cameras. In fairness, he wasn't. I mean, his words were pretty strong, but he left some. It was all still smiles, wasn't it? In that press conference, despite it all, and everyone's a bit uneasy, but there's still smiles. It's not a nasty atmosphere. Everyone's, I think, a bit confused and a bit cautious, but it wasn't. If it had ended there, on the televised part, I think there would have been more leeway for Rossi to kind of adjust his position, as the weekend went on. Maybe just say, well, that's what I was told, or I was just, stirring things up a bit. But it's those words to the Italian media afterwards that really kind of, it becomes apparent that this is a full-on attack on Marc. And as you guys have just been saying, I think the pressure was just the biggest part of it. I think it was just been building and building and building. And the first time I saw, I think it was in Japan. It was a wet race before Phillip Island, and Rossi beat Lorenzo, didn't he? I think he was second. That's right. And
because Lorenzo had a tire problem and Pedrosa won it, and Rossi, I felt like at that point Rossi beating Lorenzo was like, wow, this is like a changing moment in the World Championship.
Exactly. But the thing that a few of us were surprised by was Rossi's face after that race. He didn't look like someone who had just gained points on Lorenzo. I mean, he hadn't won a race since Silverstone. So, to gain any kind of points on Lorenzo, he'd taken his chance with the weather, whatever else, it had paid off. But he looked like somebody who kind of knew, this is going against me. It's almost like he could see, right, I've got 3 rounds. Maybe he's going, who's going to be ahead of me where? And that, I think, was almost the moment for me in Japan where you thought, why doesn't Rossi look as happy as you think he would, taking points or gaining points on his nearest title rival? That was maybe the first sign for me of that pressure that you guys have spoken about, that then obviously we know from the translations of the team, it's in the pit box as well, isn't it, and everything else. And you've got to remember that Rossi at this stage is such a huge figure, within the sport and within Yamaha as well, that it's, for someone to come in and kind of tell Rossi's side of the garage, now, come on, keep this under control, or that's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? When there's so much at stake as well, and he's your man, leading the World Championship. On the other hand, you've got Lorenzo. You've got two, a title fight between two teammates is a difficult one enough to manage as it is. But yeah, it all just added to the ingredients and that spark in the press conference. But yes, it was the words to the Italian media afterwards, and of course those lap times that were prepared, which also showed some premeditation, wasn't there? This wasn't just I just said it because I was asked a question. It was the first thing that came into my head. This was planned in that respect. And we're all just left wondering, how does this benefit Rossi? How does, he's got a massive task on his hands trying to stay ahead of Lorenzo. And now he wants to take on Marquez as well. I mean, yeah, we just couldn't see what it was. But with Rossi being Rossi and having done this successfully in the past, we're all thinking he must know what he's doing here. He must do. This is Valentino Rossi, right?
That's a really good point, Pete. And Lewis, just before you can add to that, I want to ask you about Lorenzo. There's a fantastic answer in this press conference where it's really sarcastic, and it's really, I think, Jorge Lorenzo to a T, where he got asked, obviously, do you think that Marc helped you in Phillip Island? And he said, oh yeah, I really did on the last lap when he overtook me. And it's like, Lorenzo, I think at that point, as Pete says, he's trying to process things, but he's going, hang on, this is like, why is this happening here? Like, is this going towards me? And I think Lorenzo realizes then, and his team has realized too, Rossi is feeling the pressure here.
100%. I think that there is that kind of, Lorenzo, I think at that point was pretty confident he was the fastest rider out there. He knew that he'd won 6 races at that point. I think he would win 7. He was convinced about being fast, and where some of his championship deficit had come from as well. I think that season were beyond his control. You think back to Silverstone and the fogging visor, which then pretty quickly led to a helmet manufacturer change. I remember that was my very first time in a MotoGP paddock as accredited media. I remember that for Rossi's win, for Marquez's crash when he ruled himself out the championship, for the Lorenzo helmet thing. Then there was the flag to flag race at Misano where
crashed out.
Basically, the Rossi and Lorenzo just kind of pushed each other until one of them crashed. And then, a crash in those conditions happens. And then, as you guys say, there was the issues in Japan, which weren't really his really his fault. So I think, Lorenzo, and I kind of had things gone a bit more to plan. Lorenzo is likely the one with the championship lead, and Rossi's in the opposite kind of scenario. Who knows what would have happened at that point? But definitely at that point, Lorenzo does seem more like, okay, yeah, he's rattled. And I think his response is an interesting one when you compare that sort of 4 years earlier when there was that, what was it, the Barcelona press conference with him and Simoncelli.
So it was 2011, yeah.
Yeah, and, Lorenzo had a real habit back then in his early years in MotoGP of coming across as a really sour, kind of dour individual. And when people kind of got rough with him on track, he didn't take that all that well. And then then there was that Simoncelli thing where Simoncelli said, I know, maybe I'll have to be arrested. And everyone's laughing and he's laughing. Lorenzo's going, I don't find this funny at all. We're playing with the lives, blah, 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 blah. The contrast to that, to that press conference in Sepang is night and day. And it's almost as if Lorenzo learned kind of in that moment, okay, being the super serious, just the fastest rider out there isn't going to work for me. I need to change here. And I think that was a perfect opportunity to show how much he'd evolved and how much, as Pete said, he'd learned from Rossi's use of the media. Because, as you guys have said, it's not the first time Rossi's went into a press conference with a sniper rifle. I think, what was it, after Qatar 2004, I think it might even have been in Malaysia, where he came into a press conference and said, Sessi Gibernau will never win a race again after the whole kind of grid sweeping thing. And Sessi Gibernau never did win a race again, which kind of showed the whole Rossi. It just built on that Rossi aura, didn't it? It's as if, say, this man is in full control of everything in MotoGP because he can take a rival out of the game just with his words. And obviously Rossi thought, well, I've done it before, I could do it again. I made, I've diminished Gibernau, diminished Biaggi, gone up against Stoner, faced him. I've kind of won over against Lorenzo. He's obviously thought, there is something I can do here. But I think what was probably surprised Rossi, and he'll never admit it these days, but I think was the kind of stoicism of Lorenzo to not be rattled by that at all, and obviously the subsequent kind of reaction from Marquez. But yeah, I think Lorenzo did benefit from that. He was always the underdog, and therefore the pressure's a little bit off you at that point. And when your teammates got so much pressure on them, it's even more of a boost for you, because you're like, well, I can go out and do whatever. I'm not the one who's in the firing line here.
Yeah,
and that was, I think that was one of Rossi's key mistakes there, was to kind of underestimate the growth, particularly mentally, the growth of Jorge Lorenzo.
Absolutely. And I think I want to point this out. First thing I want to say is from Aragon. So after the crash in Misano, Lorenzo was the best rider on the grid by far. He upped his game to new levels, and I think it caught Rossi. That perfect with the Japan stuff. It really caught Rossi out, even though he had taken points off him. But he knew that Lorenzo was struggling. He's like, he's not going away, because he was up the road, Lorenzo, by I think it was like 4 seconds. Obviously, the tire went and he caught him, but there was a change there, and Rossi was fighting against Danny Pedrosa in Aragon. I remember that so well, and I'm thinking, Lorenzo's gone here up the road. You're meant to be fighting with him. And Rossi was really trying to beat Pedrosa just to stay within just the least amount of points you could lose as possible. And I think getting to Sepang, I mean, the clips that MotoGP have released in their documentary, I think it's from the Lorenzo documentary in 2015, where he's in the car in Sepang and he's with, I think it's Albert Ferreira's there too. I think there's a few of his team, and they say the other guy, meaning Rossi, is feeling the pressure. This is your time, sort of. And Lorenzo's like, yep, no problem. I've got this, sort of thing. And the next point I want to get to, Pete, is qualifying. And from a personal point, I remember, I mean, very different when you're watching every session and you're working in the sport now. I remember waking up on the Friday of that weekend, and there was a clip, I think it was from Rossi and Marquez, where they were kind of playing games with each other on the track. It's like sort of cat and mouse. And I remember that was the first point going, like, holy shit, they're actually going with each other here. This is like, is it going to boil over? But Lorenzo in qualifying we started on the grid. Rossi produced a great lap to get to third and knocked Lorenzo down into the second row, which felt like that's a real strike from Rossi here. He's moved Lorenzo back. We get to the press conference for qualifying. Marquez is obviously there with Danny Pedrosa, and Rossi gets asked the question, are you going to kind of like just let this slide, sort of thing? And it's Rossi's answer is, don't really think so. And so he just hopes that everyone does the race. That's what he says. He hopes everyone has the race and they do it fairly. And Marquez says the same. He's like, yeah, well, I want to fight for the win. I know Valentino's going to be there. I know Jorge's going to be there. Danny's going to be there. But then the atmosphere changes with the fans at the circuit. This is the key point. Marquez's name gets spoke out on the PA, and there's a ring of boos. And even at that point, and Marquez has admitted in his documentaries, he's like, what are they booing me for? What have I done, sort of thing? And that's when he realises, and there's a great clip where he's in the garage and he goes, the atmosphere's a bit tense out there, isn't it? To one of his mechanics. Do you think at this point, Pete, Marquez's plan has changed on what he's going to do in the race? Because he was quick that weekend, there's no doubt about it. Danny Pedrosa probably had more. But does Marquez think, well, hang on, is this, you're going to get something from me here because of what you've caused?
I think Marc's reaction was interesting, because Lewis was talking there about how Lorenzo, didn't used to come across very well in some of his press conferences, and Marc had come off second best with Rossi twice, hadn't he, already this year? In Argentina, he clipped the back of him. Bit of argument, well, not publicly, but there was some discussion about whether Marc felt that Rossi had cut across him, whatever else. Again, no one got punished. No one was seen to have broken the rules. But still, there we come to Assen. Marc tries to make the pass at the last corner. Rossi straight lines it, basically outsmarts him a bit. How much he had that in mind? Did Rossi go into that corner thinking, if he tries something, I know what I'm going to do? Who knows? But anyway, he played it perfectly. And Marc didn't come across well in the press conference afterwards. He was pissed off, and he was quite sort of sulky and everything else. And I think that he did learn from that. I think he realized that, just as Lewis was saying about Jorge Lorenzo, that, even if you really feel like you've been hard done by, how you present yourself matters. And I think that Marc realized that getting involved in a verbal slugging match, if you like, with Valentino Rossi is not going to end well for him. And so I think it's the first time we start to see Marc maybe have that moment of, I do my talking on the racetrack. And that he then brought up recently Misano 2025, wasn't it? And all that. So he's carried that with him since. And I think that was probably during that season was when he realized, that's how I solve these problems. And you're right to read about Saturday and everything else. Everyone was sort of examining, during practice, are these two guys going to come together? Is Marc going to help Lorenzo? Is something going to happen? And as you say, they were following, when Marc starts following Rossi, and Rossi sort of, I think he turns around and sort of waves at him or something. He's a bit annoyed that Marc just won't get on his way. And we all thought, oh, here we go. But then afterwards, Rossi sort of played it down. He could have poured petrol on the fire there and gone, you see, this is what I'm talking about. But he kind of went, it was just a normal thing. So I don't know whether that was combined with what you're saying about in the qualifying press conference as well. Rossi may be having second thoughts about, hang on a minute, I don't need to stoke this, or whether someone, people in his team, we believe that, Lynn Jarvis said he didn't know what Rossi was going to do on the Thursday. And let's remember, there's 2 days between Thursday and the race. So, everyone is expecting there to be fireworks. Surely that's also within Yamaha. They're now going, look, we think there could be a problem here, and you need to kind of don't make it worse. Whether that's what was going on there, I don't know. But certainly Rossi didn't throw any more fuel on the fire during those 2 days, did he? Friday, Saturday. But it was clear also that Marc, everyone, if they came together on Sunday, everybody was expecting fireworks. And exactly what Rossi and Yamaha were expecting, we don't know. But that's really what everyone else was expecting. You can see that from the commentary with Nick Harris and what they're saying. They're just saying what everyone in the paddock was thinking, which is, here we go. This is the payback for what happened on Thursday.
Yeah. It's a weird thing for me, Lewis, thinking back about it, because I remember waking up and you just used to watch it, and I was thinking, what's going to happen today? It felt like something was just going to happen. It's so hard to explain, because I almost look at it. It's really strange in the sense that I always think that if you looked at this from you haven't watched MotoGP before, you'd think Marquez and Rossi were the two title fighters. It's the maddest thing ever. I think it's going after each other, and as Pete brings up the points from the past that Marquez had learned from us and he had learned from Argentina, and at this point Marquez is going, his team had probably said, listen, you just do what you do on the track because we know you're the best, sort of thing. And then we get what we get in the race. But what do you remember even just about the race? Because the start of the race it's amazing, to be honest, the first few laps that you get.
Yeah, I had to rewatch the race quite recently because I hadn't actually watched it back since. I've seen the clips and all the rest of it and remember the kind of the flashpoints, but I hadn't actually kind of remembered how un-Rossi-like Rossi looked on that bike. He was riding nervously. You could see there was a moment really early on where Lorenzo goes for an overtake and Rossi comes back up the inside. And it was almost quite a meek surrender of that position because Rossi was well alongside. He could have run Lorenzo out of room a little bit, or even, a little bit of contact there, just spook Lorenzo a bit, something that Rossi would have done in the past. You think back to Japan 2010, when Lorenzo was about to win the championship and Rossi wasn't really in the hunt, and Rossi was going after him, and Lorenzo afterwards, again going back to the Lorenzo thing, was really upset by it, and again complaining, Rossi shouldn't be doing this, he's not in the championship fight, it's not fair, blah blah blah. Which is the ironic thing about this whole Sepang, Rossi thing 2015, is Rossi is complaining about the things he used to do, but Rossi until that point had never been on the receiving end of it. So it felt, you saw that. Because I watched it with my partner the other day, and I think that's isn't Rossi on the bike. Anyone else would have run tried to get Lorenzo set up and made a bit of, or just fought a bit harder. He could have done that, and he just gave a really late sort of, oh no, I don't want to do this. I'm too, I have a crash sort of thing. And we saw that when Marc then got to him, because he was riding so kind of controlled. Marc got to him really quickly. And obviously Marquez went for a move. Rossi tried to get back at him, and Marquez was like, this is not the battle you want to fight. And 100% Marquez turned the switch off and let Rossi know. There is no denying that was payback, because you look at some of the overtakes. There was one on the way into turn 4 where the Marquez is really far back, jams on the brakes. Yeah. The rear steps out. There's no way he's getting into the corner. Somehow he does, gets Rossi. The two of them are side by side. It was a great scrap. But Marquez is like really, really going for it more than he would have done any other time. So there's no doubting in that point that Marquez wasn't deliberately trying to sabotage Rossi's championship. What he was trying to do there was go, I guess I suppose he was in a little bit in that sense of being like, okay, you've accused me of this, so let's have a fight. Here's your payback. If you think, come and give me your best sort of thing. And I think I don't necessarily think Marquez was it's not against the rules to fight with a championship contender. There's this unwritten gentleman's agreement, blah 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 gentleman's agreement. It's motorsport, for goodness sake.
My point is, who's a gentleman in this point? Is Valentino Rossi a gentleman? No. Is Marquez? No. This is racing.
The thing about these types of things, you kind of have to earn that respect to not be, for that gentleman's agreement to work. And Rossi had not respected Marquez there on Thursday. So, it's Marquez, I kind of feel like he was well within his rights to do that. You've poked the bear. Rossi's played a mind game, done something he used to do, and it's backfired. And that's you reap what you sow. In motorsport, you live by the sword, die by the sword. That's it. Marquez did to Rossi what Rossi's done to so many people countless times over the years. And yeah, just for me, the overarching kind of thing that I took away from rewatching that race was just how nervous Rossi was until the point that Marquez started overtaking him, which is kind of a shame that Rossi sort of then reacted the way he did, because I actually felt that battle was quite good for Rossi to switch his brain off, because he then all of a sudden started riding like Valentino Rossi. There was that obviously front end moment which he saved, and then got really back into it. And I kind of think, actually, if you just let that fight go a bit longer, Marc would have ruined his tyres. Yes, Lorenzo was gone, but A, you would have still finished third. B, you would not have started at the back of the grid in Valencia. And therefore, C, who knows what would have happened in Valencia. The fact was, he was that day fast enough to be fourth. But if the points situation had been different, all the rest, had there been no penalty, things would have been totally different. And had that not happened, there wouldn't have been in Valencia the whole kind of pre-race thing from the FIM and from Dorna being like, if you're not in the championship battle, do not get involved. Because what we saw in that Grand Prix was kind of Marquez and Pedrosa being really cautious because they didn't want to get involved in anything else. But had that not been issued, there might have been a bit more. Marquez would have went a bit harder on Lorenzo, being like, I don't care. Not my title fight. They're not the best of friends anyway. Who knows? I think ultimately Rossi lost the championship because of this, not because of Marc, but because of his own actions. He lost the championship on Thursday in Sepang, and Rossi's going to have to take that on the chin. I think the other thing as well about the pressure, which I wanted to mention earlier, was Rossi hadn't ever really been in that situation before. The last time he had a championship that went down to the wire was 2006, and he lost that. Rossi's other championships he was in control. Yes, there was rivalry and such, but he won them with rounds to spare. I don't think he didn't ever go to a final round showdown. So I'm not surprised, kind of looking back, that there was that pressure there, because he hadn't been in that position. The last time he'd been in that position, he lost.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew that, history that has a tendency to repeat itself. And I think all those, again, are contributing factors, is the fact that he knew the last time it's happened, it didn't go well. And now I'm going up against Jorge Lorenzo, which is no disrespect to Nicky Hayden, but Jorge Lorenzo is a completely different proposition to Nicky Hayden of 2006.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think, Rossi lost that championship on Thursday. I think he made a gamble. It backfired spectacularly. I don't think to this day you can really blame. People like to blame Marquez for that. We've had people come out and be, what he did was blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, what he did was race.
Yeah.
Much like in Australia, what you saw in Australia was a motor race. Mm-hmm. And I think the tyre pressure thing and tyre temperature thing is even more easily explained nowadays, because look how much tyre temperatures and tyre pressures have. You can see the visible impact that has on racing now. So I kind of actually think Marquez's situation from 2015 is aged much, much better than Rossi's has because of all those various factors.
Yeah, but when I think about the race now, it's like this, as you said, like historical. It's like almost like, did I watch that sort of thing? Like it doesn't feel like a MotoGP race. It feels like I've just dreamt this like weird sort of Street Fighter combination, and you get it feels like the race ends on lap 7, because I remember this. I remember it happening. Obviously, I'm talking about when Rossi slows down Marquez, and you hear the screams from the TV camera, the crowd, the commentators. The commentators lost their minds. I remember watching it on BT at the time, and obviously I then seen the world feed, and I was just like, this is like, what's just happening? You don't know how to process it. And for me, in terms of the Marquez stuff, people blame him, saying he should never have got involved. See, if someone punches you in the mouth and says you've done something, you're going to give it back to them. I don't care. It's your reaction. You're going to fight your corner. And there's no problem in my eyes what Marc done. He ran wide, I think it was lap 2, and Lorenzo got through. And Rossi then sets his sights on Marquez. They were going to meet that day no matter what. It was fate. And Pete, I want to bring you in on this because you were at the circuit. You were you're the closest thing to it out of all of us in terms of the atmosphere, the heat, whatever. Those overtakes start as loose as they get closer and closer, and they get a bit more on the edge. Marquez wipes the nose of Rossi at one stage, and you're thinking, my God, this is getting properly tasty. Like, it was really heated. But when that moment happens, when Rossi sets him up and they come together, can you remember what you were thinking at that point?
We were all just staring at each other. We couldn't really believe what we'd seen, as you guys say. And let's remember, until that point, there hadn't been any contact between them. So it's a bit like, to come back to what Lewis mentioned earlier, it was almost, normally when you get two riders that clash, it sort of escalates, doesn't it? It starts off as being nice passes with a lot of room, and then they get a bit more desperate, and then there's some contact, and then eventually someone goes down. And this was almost a surprise, because they hadn't, as amazing and as cutthroat as the racing was, they didn't make contact. They weren't banging into each other on the straight like Lorenzo and Rossi at Motegi in 2010 or anything like that. So it was almost, it suddenly leapt from that to Rossi sitting up, looking over, and it was just, of all people in a battle like that, you'd have backed Valentino Rossi. He'd come out, on top of Marc twice already that year. You think he'd do it again? I mean, there was no guarantee that this was going to go into Marc's favour. This wasn't a one-sided contest at all. Heading into it, you'd have said, well, look, this is Rossi. This is what he does. He loves this sort of battles. You're getting into a fight with Marc. I thought Marc's going to end up being sent out into the gravel trap like Gibernau at the final corner of Jerez, in 2005. Easily done. I mean, Rossi could do those sort of moves that other people couldn't in close combat, and keep just on that line of it being a racing incident, And so to see him sit up and look over, it was just in itself is what's going on here. And then of course the contact and he falls. It was unbelievable, because it was so obviously going to be a penalty. And it was just there was just this shock, and everyone's looking at each other and everyone's pointing at the screens and not really believing what they're seeing, to be honest. You say the crowd is going crazy. The crowd are kind of celebrating, I think, that Marc's on the floor, because they don't quite realize the significance, which is, if clearly Rossi has caused this accident, and if you cause an accident, you're causing danger and you're getting a penalty. And the fact he's looked over beforehand means he's clearly doing it deliberately or irresponsibly, as the rule states. So he's ticked both parts of the penalty box. It was just, it just felt like unbelievable that Rossi, of all people, who excelled in those kind of situations, would be the one to kind of overstep the mark and end up clearly walking into a penalty, basically, especially when it didn't seem like he needed to. I just felt that, as you guys were saying, that the battle, it was amazing, but it wasn't getting crazy. They weren't slamming into each other, bouncing off each other. Yeah, they were holding each other up, undoubtedly, but there's no question neither of them was breaking any rules. There's no contact. No. I mean, to be honest, it couldn't have gone on all race because it was too intense. Something had to give, but it was still a surprise that it happened. It happened that quick, if you like. It went from being just a mind-blowing race to suddenly being a clear penalty.
Yeah, and I'm just going to give a shout out to my brother, because I remember we were sitting watching it. If you're listening to this, Reese, probably not, but I just remember him saying, "What's he doing?" Like, he just shouted, "What's he doing?" And then it happens. And then we were just sat at each other going, like, immediately I thought, he's going to get black flagged, Rossi. I thought he's going to get disqualified. But you get the explanation after, Pete. I want to ask you about this, because Lewis said about how it changed the stewarding of racing. It did. I mean, it's the modern, well, it's kind of the modern process we have now, but it's slightly modified. But Mike Webb was, in effect, the head of two separate things. He was the FIM race director, and he was also like the head of the stewards. And he made it clear in the race, there's a graphic comes across, it'll be investigated after the race, because he wanted to hear from Rossi, he wanted to hear from Marquez, he wanted to hear from whoever was on each side.
Yeah, I think the difficulty there was a lot of people, and you can see this on the live commentary from all the various countries, when they saw the action take place, they believed that Rossi had kicked Marquez. And so if you then base it on the punishment on that, it's obviously different to when you then look at the footage and it's not proven, which is what it turned out to be. And so I think that was the grey area, and they didn't have all the camera angles that they have now and everything else. And as you say, Mike Webb's got a race to run at the same time with yellow flags, incidents, all this other stuff going on. So with such a big decision to make, I think he realized that I want to cover every angle on this. I want every bit of footage we can get. I want to speak to everyone involved. And you only have to look at Abu Dhabi, was it 6 years later, to see the dangers of F1, of rushing a decision. I mean, I'm sure, it's nice and tidy to get everything sorted out in a race, but if you get it wrong, it can go catastrophically wrong. And if a punishment had been based on a kick, and then it turns out that Rossi says, well, no, it wasn't a kick, and show me the evidence for it. And as we see, there was no smoking gun evidence of a kick. Well, it's too late. He's been punished on the basis that it was a kick. The kick is, when I say kick, it means deliberately caused Marquez to fall, which is what Rossi contests, isn't it? He says, yes, I deliberately sat up and ran him wide. I didn't want him to crash. And so that's where there's this difference, isn't it? It was whether Rossi deliberately wanted Marquez on the ground or not, basically. He says no, and Marquez says, well, there was a kick, and it's never been proven either way. So that's why, I think, because there was this grey area, that's why you need to look at it after the race, and especially when, you've only got so many resources. But as you guys have said, the FIM stewards panel that we have now, that's kind of the solution, is just to give people a specific job, just to look at incidents in that way, and leave people to run the race as a separate job. But really, I think under the circumstances and with the footage available, I think still you'd say, if you want to get the call right with so much riding on it, it's a big thing to do, and kind of in the middle of a race.
Yeah. So Valentino Rossi finishes third. Jorge Lorenzo's second. He's pretty happy. And the forgotten winner, I always feel sorry for poor Dani Pedrosa. He always wins and no one really cares because there's always something happening around it. Lewis, everything happens then after. Lorenzo's reaction, there's really good footage where you see him looking at the screen as Rossi's watching the screen before the podium, and Lorenzo just goes, what have you just done, sort of thing? And then Pedro's asked, what happened there between you and Marc? And Rossi says some choice words. If you want to see it, it's in the documentary that Dorna's just released. Lorenzo obviously wants to fight his corner. He's thinking, give me the title here, pretty much, because this is not on. And then we get the moment where Marquez and Valentino Rossi see each other for the first time after in the steward's room or the whatever room they were in, and Rossi says, obviously this is all sarcastic, bravo, great race, and Marquez responds, nice kick, and Rossi goes, what? And then the door shuts, and like we could have had the greatest documentary of all time right there if there was a camera inside.
But the thing that kind of stands out for me amongst all that is the bit behind the podium. Lorenzo and Pedro are talking about it, and Rossi says to Danny asks Rossi what happened. Rossi's like, well, Marc, he's a son of a bitch, and blah, blah, blah. Danny's obviously sat there going, oh, no, because he's stuck in the middle. But the thing for me that kind of in hindsight is quite funny is the person that ushers him onto the podium is Yamaha's now PR person, Maida. And I bet she's so glad that she wasn't involved in the Yamaha's PR department at that time, because, I mean, the absolute nightmare that would have been for a PR person. But yeah, I think I want to address the kick thing first of all, because I think it's the thing that obviously a lot of listeners will want to... There is no conclusive evidence. Honda said they had data. I remember for the weeks building up to Valencia, we're going to release the data, and then there was a statement they released being like, okay, we're not going to, for the good of the championship, which to me was a data trace will only show that there was a spike in braking, which led to Marquez crashing. That doesn't... It doesn't register whether that spike in pressure was caused by Marquez's right hand, which it probably was, or whatnot, and kicking a MotoGP bike lent over, the thing's 180 kilograms, that's you try kicking 180 kilograms, it's gonna hurt. The acrobatics involved in getting your foot round to touch somebody's brake lever, a 36-year-old man, I'm not 100% convinced can do that. I'm 29 and I definitely don't have that type of flexibility. So, but what you can see is there is definitely contact. Marquez's body leans on Rossi's leg, and then there's the movement, and so the stewards were right, because you can't say it one way or the other. Marquez's body made contact. Rossi's leg either slips off the foot peg, or he kind of reacts as if somebody does.
His knee, like the get off me sort of thing.
Exactly.
Like a push.
I to this day believe a lot of things about Valentino Rossi. I don't believe he would have kicked a competitor. I just don't. The kick doesn't really fit logic as far as I'm concerned. So. No, I don't think there was a kick there. I think the stewards were absolutely right to investigate after the race. There's always been the arguments of, they should have given him a ride through a penalty and that had been done with it, blah, blah, blah.
Championship's over then. It's finished. If
that
makes sense. Lorenzo wins it easier, if that makes sense, like in the points way, if you do that.
It's not even that. I think it's just that if the consequence is just ride through a penalty, then it's like, well, okay, then a new standard is set for any type of incident that's ride through a penalty. The stewards had to, at the time, they had to ask both riders what happened, because there was this reasonable doubt about, because if Rossi did kick, if they had footage that he kicked him, or if Rossi went into the pit box, full of piss and vinegar and said, oh yeah, I did kick him because he was pissing me off, all of a sudden that changes things completely. That goes from being a penalty point to being a disqualified from the championship type offence. So the stewards and race directors at the time were just between a rock and a hard place, and then because of that, it then bred all this. Oh well, it's a complete Dorna Spanish conspiracy, and there was no winning for Dorna in that incident whatsoever. They could do whatever they want and say what they wanted. There was just no winning for them. Lorenzo's reaction is not surprising. He's spoken about this recently, actually being like,
I love it. It's class.
He was like, okay, now obviously it benefited me to try and stir the pot a bit, like obviously I was going to do it, and fair enough, you got to play all your cards. Why not? I think, obviously, the fact he tried to take the appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, probably at the behest of Yamaha, really, it's not, probably just didn't really do much for the internal management of that situation. But you're going to try. He said recently, like, oh, if Rossi got disqualified or whatnot, it benefited my championship. So of course I'm going to go and trying to. I was younger, you know what I'm like. I'm going to say what I'm going to say. Fair play, you know. You got to respect that, especially now. At least he's honest about it.
Yeah.
But again, it just feeds into this whole thing of the ball's in Lorenzo's court now. He's got all the, you know, he's still behind in the championship, but he's like, well, Rossi's got back at the grid start. I'm faster. His mind's just completely gone now. So I'm gonna keep kicking the hornet's nest and see what I can get out of it, because it's only going to upset and anger Rossi. But the other thing about the penalty, Rossi was given 3 penalty points ultimately.
Yeah.
Rossi gets the back of the grid start because he has a penalty point at Misano for getting in Lorenzo's way in qualifying. Ultimately, had he just been a bit more intelligent in that qualifying session, he gets 3 penalty points, and that would have been it. Yeah, it would have made practice and qualifying maybe a little bit nervy for him in Valencia, but like fundamentally, he's starting probably second row at worst at that point in the kind of MotoGP when what the competitive order was. Again, as I said earlier, like the complexion of this final round, the championship battle changes completely. Had just certain decisions been different for Rossi, one of them being what happened in Misano, the next one being obviously what happened on Thursday in Sepang. But as a rider, I do think you kind of have to, if you're in a championship situation, you have to be a bit more intelligent in that to go, okay, well, I've got 1 penalty point so far. I could earn enough penalty points conceivably to get a pretty hefty penalty here. I've got to be wary of that. The whole point of a penalty point system is to be a deterrent. And so it goes back to, you know, that incident of just clearly Rossi's mind had gone. He wasn't thinking about the championship. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He was, I believe at that point he felt he was well within his rights to do what he did, because he was like, well, Marquez is getting in my way. You know, I'm a championship challenger, blah, blah, blah. I didn't cause him to crash. I just wanted to run him wide, etc., etc., etc. It just, more and more pressure he just put on, how the pressure clouded his judgment. And again, it just adds to that whole kind of thing of how this really is just sad, because this is a guy that exerted pressure on people, you know, forced them to crack. You know, it just, I will never not be convinced that Valentino Rossi was the maker of his own demise in this championship battle, and I guess that's why he carries on to this day of maintaining that Marquez stole his championship, that there was this conspiracy, all the rest of it, because I just think he just genuinely he has to believe that now, because I think he does know deep down that he played the situation, several situations, badly, and you know, he has to go with it now. Whether he even believed that Australia thing in the first place is that's the other question about this, is nobody's ever really considered that, and I still have doubts in my mind about that, is whether he actually believes that. But because it got a reaction out of Marquez, it stirred the pot, and then Sepang happened, it kind of got to a point where he was like, well, I can't backtrack now. I can't not say that, okay, well, actually, I'm not so sure anymore. He has to just go full into it. And that's the other problem as well, is once you state your position, once you say these things, they're in the public domain, it's very hard to retract them, because if you retract them, then it makes you look wrong or silly or whatever. And if you've lost a championship because of all these things, it then makes it look like you tripped yourself up, which, you know, as we know athletes are and racers are, they're big egos. And Rossi's still a competitive athlete as well. Let's not forget that. He's still an active combatant in racing. His ego hasn't diminished. So, of course, he's going to continue to this day go, well, I got screwed over. because you wouldn't admit 10 years on having seen all of this and gone, yeah, that was my fault. I hold my hands up to that now. It's not gonna happen.
Yeah, and this is the point that I don't show any sympathy at all. I'm like, you knew what you had at stake. You had the championship in your hands, and for me, you were stupid enough not to consider who Marquez was and is, and this is what I think you say done it for so many years to people where he had said something, and it rattled them, and they were like, not going near there, because you're not going up against Rossi, you're going up against the fan base, you're going up against the Italian press majority of the time, you're the enemy essentially of Rossi, and I think he just threw the grenade and it rolled right back under his chair, and it just and the grenade being Marquez essentially. I think it was just the way the story has went. If you had written a book about this, it's the perfect story, because you're looking at the kid who is seen as the next prodigy of MotoGP, who is just not going to lie down to anybody, and that's what I think it is.
The ironic thing about all this as well is that in 4, 5, 6 years' time, if Liberty sort of take over MotoGP, does propel it to the levels of F1, this will almost certainly be a plot point for a film,
a movie, 100%.
You know, it just is one of those things that we're sat here now, we're an hour and 10 minutes into a podcast talking about it. That's how people like to go, move on from the past, but it is, as I mentioned at the start, it's like
different.
A historical moment. It's like, it's like we talk about the Second World War. It's like it's that important in the realms, and it's that important in the realms of MotoGP. There's everything that coalesces around it, and everything that happened as a result, and the implications that are still felt to this day. Because even Marquez's championship run this year cannot be separated from Rossi.
15.
And as if continues to get closer to all the win records and stuff, and maybe even overtakes him in terms of championships, 2015 will always be such a focal point of that statistic, because it's gone from just being sort of baton passing to being I've got the last laugh here sort of thing, and obviously this is all happening in real time for Rossi. He's sat on the sidelines watching his records being chipped away and whittled away by someone he genuinely, genuinely hates, but believes that it robbed him of a championship. It just, for another 10 years, however long Marquez is still racing for, and that will forever follow along. And we will not stop talking about this for a long, long time.
No, we won't. And Pete, I want to bring you in on it, but I just want to say, I think that Marquez's career will be defined by his amazing talent, but as Lewis says, this is Marquez's moment as well, as much as Rossi's, because it affects him years down the line. It still does today. We even seen it at Lozano, the boos for him. Obviously, people will be like, oh, they've got less, but he still is polarizing Marquez to these fans, and he's the smiling assassin at the end of the day. That's the way I see him. He is the baby-faced assassin who just, you don't poke him because he will just go for you. He is the opposite of Rossi, but they're very alike. And I think that's why we get this clash of character, because it's literally, essentially the two same people just meet, and this is what happens.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Yeah, they're so similar, aren't they? I mean, only go back a year or two, and they were kind of the two who were in a little group, and Lorenzo was on the other side, and Marc was doing the hard racing like Rossi, and Lorenzo was complaining, and that's where the divide was. And then suddenly, I don't know, you could see they were too similar. They were too similar to remain friends, I think. And as you say, inevitably there's going to be this huge sort of explosion at some point, I think. And the other surprise for me, I suppose, in the battle at Sepang was really that there'd been over 2 days since Thursday, and yet there was no plan B, it seemed, for Rossi. They didn't seem to have a strategy for, okay, we did what we thought was going to be a good move on Thursday, there must have been people like Lynn Jarvis going, look, that wasn't a great decision. So why didn't they, hammer out, right, this is what we're going to do. If Marquez is in front of us, we do this. If he's behind us, we do that. If he's running a good pace, we just stay away from, but it seemed like there was no preparation at all. And Rossi, that moment when he puts his hand up, doesn't he, quite early on in the battle, and sort of looks back at Marc as if to say,
what are you doing?
What are you doing, isn't it? Yeah. And he even says that, doesn't he, when he's asked, why did you look over at Marc when you ran him off the track? And he says, because I'm asking, what the F are you doing, kind of thing, isn't it? Which again gives this idea of kind of total surprise at what Marquez is doing, despite the fact that everyone else seemed to see that it was coming. And that just underlines that there was no plan in place for, okay, if Marc does mess with you, this is what you do, and I think that's also why everything just comes to a head, and Rossi jumps to this radical move of sitting up and guiding Marc off track, is because he doesn't know how to get out of that situation. And just so surprising, because he'd never been like, he was always the guy who reveled those situations and always emerged on top pretty much, all those famous passes that he would make and everything else. And yet here he is, uncomfortable in close quarters battle. And I think of all the kind of the reaction afterwards, it's obviously polarized. People, get behind one ride or the other. But I thought Lynn Jarvis was good in his kind of delivery on the day, at least, his initial reaction, where he said, look, this was the reaction of the revenge of Marc to the statements of Valentino on Thursday. So Lynn Jarvis, even though he's Rossi's boss, is clearly connecting these 2 points, which Rossi is disputing, but saying, look, this has happened because of what Valentino said to the media on Thursday. He also points out Marc did nothing illegal. Again, he's, so, and this is Rossi's boss pointing out none of the moves that Marc made were illegal, but he also says, look, it was not a normal race. He was messing with Valentino. Valentino got frustrated, and he made, I think he calls it, an incorrect move. So again, he's accepting that the move that Rossi made was wrong and everything else. And and at the end of it all, kind of admitted that he didn't know that what was happening, what Rossi said on Thursday was going to happen. And I think someone asked him, well, what would you have done? And he avoided kind of directly criticizing it. But clearly, Lynn Jarvis would not have advised Rossi to go down that route. And I think it does show that in those massive high-pressure situations, you need to keep that kind of command hierarchy, don't you, where as big a rider as you are still a rider in a team, and everyone needs to know, be on the same. Okay, it's difficult because your teammates fighting for a title, so that splits the team. But you're all on the same you're all on the same hymn sheet, as we would say, aren't you? With the decisions that you make and what you're going to do, and instead it seems like this comes out of just Rossi's small group, and is a surprise to Yamaha, his employers, his boss. But again, that doesn't explain why that they didn't sit in that gap between Thursday and the race, just sit down and go, look, okay, we think this was a bad idea, but this is where we are, and this is what you're going to do. It seemed like Rossi went into that race honestly thinking it's just going to be a normal race, and that maybe contributed to that sort of shock and the sort of radical extreme measure that he took to end that contest, which cost him so dearly, as you guys said.
Yeah, it did. It did. It cost him a world title. At the end of the day, whether he would have won the world title if he had played it normally, I personally of the opinion, I don't think he was going to win the world title. I think Jorge Lorenzo, as I said before, was the man. I think he was the best rider that year. Rossi was extremely consistent, and I'll give Valentino so much credit for that. His worst result was 5th over the whole season. I mean, it was just incredible, and I think that Jorge was just better. I mean, you can debate about, if he had got a clear run here. Valencia, to me, if Rossi starts second row, he finishes 4th. Purely because he wasn't quick enough. I just don't think it was.
I think, like I said earlier, I think, had it not been for the penalty, had Rossi played things differently, then the situation is a bit different had that clash not happened, because there's less kind of scrutiny on overtakes on championship leaders. So the Hondas, for example, both Hondas were quick, but they just, you saw in that Valencia race, they were just a bit too, they couldn't really get a clean move lined up, so they weren't going to go for something that could potentially then just erupt all this chaos again, as it had done already. And who knows what happened. And then Honda's overtake Lorenzo gets pushed back to 3rd, Rossi's 4th. I think that probably wins Rossi the championship, doesn't it? So it's yeah. I think a lot of this is, again, Rossi's reaped what he sowed there, really, and he'll have to he has to accept that. And I think it's cost him greater than the championship, but I think it has, like I said, damaged his reputation. Yeah, there'll be people like, Rossi, biggest rider, he's the GOAT, blah blah blah. Well, if you're a Rossi fan, you're not gonna
you're not going to admit it, are you?
You're not going to be on the other side of the coin. Let's be real. I don't think, if there's Rossi fans listening, which I'm sure there will be, I'm not minimizing your opinions. I don't think your opinions are invalid. However, your judgment is going to be clouded by the fact that your favorite rider was involved. To be fair though, I do get a lot of comments about this on social media and stuff, and a lot of people, I was a Rossi fan, but there are a lot of people, as time has gone on, I think there is definitely a slow kind of switch to people going, yeah, it's hard to defend that now. And I think people are a bit fed up of him constantly bringing it up as well, in terms of like, I was robbed. And it's like, man, your career is still kind of really legendary. You've done so much for MotoGP. You're continuing to cut, like, over the next few years, you've got legitimate opportunities to win the 24 Hours in Le Mans, which would be a huge. I mean, he was very, very close to doing so this year. Had the car not broken overnight, they were in a very good position, and it's stuff like that where it's like, man, you've got kids now, family, you've got the academy who are doing great things in MotoGP. You've done so much, and this is the other thing as well, is like, Rossi was always like a really cool dude. Like, he was flamboyant, he was fun, but like away from the track as well, he was one of the few kind of elite sports people to have a voice. You think back to things like the Iraq war helmet. He rode in testing one year, and he's always had that mind about him. And it's just, this one incident just poisons so much of that chalice, because it's, it's so hard to defend any aspect of what Rossi did, in Sepang and afterwards, and since that season. I think the other criticism needs to fall on Yamaha. It has to fall on Yamaha, as Pete said. The way the management worked there wasn't. They let the power of Rossi sort of take too much control there, when sometimes, as you say, Pete, a rider needs to be reminded that they are, at the end of the day, an employee. And subsequently, when we get to Valencia, there was a kind of a bit. Once the checkered flag had fallen, where Yamaha had kind of sort of fallen in line with Rossi. The kind of reasonably balanced Lynn Jarvis comments sort of switched to being like, yeah, we've had a championship taken away, blah, blah, blah. And that then led to really muted celebrations for Jorge Lorenzo. After Yamaha riders won the championship, Jorge Lorenzo's won a third world championship.
And
there.
I think that's where their relationship ends.
I know it's 100% where the relationship ends, because it happened at the wrong time, because obviously 2016 was a contract year for the next years. Lorenzo, wholly and rightfully unhappy with the way he was treated by Yamaha at that point, was like, well, I'm going to go. And, obviously, like I said, that then led to him moving to Ducati, which was a move that didn't work out until it did. But at the point that it worked out, Ducati had been really impatient and made a decision to move on. So then Lorenzo ends up at Honda, career over. Afterwards, Rossi, with all that, as 2016 comes along, Yamaha starts. Lorenzo leaves, and Yamaha starts that slow decline to, where you get to moments like Austria 2017, where Yamaha are having to publicly apologize for how bad the bike is. To the problems that Yamaha had with Maverick Vinales, and that relationship ending. And yes, they got Fabio Quartararo and they got a championship, but had Lorenzo remained a Yamaha rider, what was possible beyond 2015? Given what Lorenzo was able to do in a Ducati and all the rest of it, and imagine a Yamaha team of Lorenzo and Fabio Quartararo, and how those two could have riffed off each other, and there's just so many strands that happen, that things happen in MotoGP that come from Sepang 2015.
Yeah, Absolutely. Well, I think we're nearly done, gents. I mean, it's great to be talking about this. Honestly, I know people say it gets wrung out every year, but it's good to talk about. Honestly, I think it'll make a really good book one day, maybe a good film. It'll be something that, yeah, it's more than just it's more than Abu Dhabi 21 for F1. It's more than that. It's just, yeah, 2 weeks of my life that when I think about it, at the point I was, it was just gripping as a fan and a person trying to start out in journalism. It was just fascinating. It was really, really just, yeah, it was Hollywood. And who knows, in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, will we ever get more answers from other people involved? There'll be books written, there'll be stories to be out there. But I do think that when you look after like everything that's happened and how it's felt, Marquez has got to where he wanted to be in his career eventually by winning his world titles and fulfilling himself that way. But the big question for me is has Valentino Rossi ever fulfilled the gap that was so close to winning number 10? I mean, we'll never know now, but he'll never admit it. But yeah, it's a season that's incredible. If anyone that's new to MotoGP, just watch it. Just give it a watch. The whole season is just so thrilling. And I really do think that was the change, because we obviously got regulation changes, teams moved on, teams got better, bikes got worse, bikes got better. It was just, yeah, it was MotoGP as at the point of my life where I'll never forget it. It's just, yeah, and Pete as well, you obviously were there and you've seen how it progressed. I mean, you have the last word on it, Pete, because you were there. But when that day finished, and maybe 2 weeks later in Valencia when it finished, can you remember thinking, I need to go to bed now, or I need to take a break? How did you feel?
Those last two races were just almost completely detached from the rest of the season, in terms of the character, the atmosphere, everything you guys have been saying. It would have been better if the end of the season was that Phillip Island race. That would have fitted with the year that we'd had up until then, and that would have been perfect. And instead, it all unravels. We'd had this fantastic season. It was all building up to this great finale, and we didn't know which way it might go because it was so close. And instead, it just all collapses to the point where, as you guys are saying, nobody really won. That was how it felt. Lorenzo didn't get the credit he should have got for being a champion. Rossi didn't get the credit for putting up this incredible sort of last effort in his career at this age of 36, and beating, the young guys that were, everyone knew that Lorenzo, Marquez were going to be all-time greats as well, even at that stage of their career. So, yeah, it just all felt a bit kind of flat and almost, I think it took a lot out of all of the riders as well. Rossi especially. I remember there were obviously big changes for 2016 coming in, Michelin tyres, the ECU. So you have the race at Valencia. Then, of course, you have the Valencia test. That's the start of the new era. And Rossi just I remember he looked exhausted. You do the last debrief of the year at the Valencia test. Everything's been taken down around you, so it's just up against the back of a lorry, and Rossi's there and he's telling us about the Michelin tires and ECU and everything else, and I sort of asked him how much the energy and how are you going to sort of recharge, and you could see he sort of paused, and you could see how much that year took out of him, and kind of the pressure he'd been carrying with him. Even Marc this year, where he was guaranteed to win the title from about the middle of the season, wasn't he? Admitted to that pressure he felt going into Motegi. Well, Rossi was being asked from about round 3 about winning the championship. What will it mean to win the 10th championship? Will it be your best championship? It's all, every single round throughout the year, because he was leading almost like the entire season. He had that pressure. And I think it just really wore him down in the end. And it all just unraveled unbelievably in those last 2 rounds. And in a way that nobody imagined. Everyone thought it was building up to be a great thing. And it all just collapsed. And it's such a shame, because if you look at it for what it is, as we're saying, even the Sepang moments with the passing, it's just incredible racing by 2 riders, super skilled, on the limit, no contact, and just going at it. But it's everything around it, as you mentioned. So just a real shame, because, as I say, up until Phillip Island, it was a dream season. It was the greatest season that I covered in MotoGP for a variety of reasons. The racing, everything unpredictable, loads of storylines, everything else, and then it just took a massive U-turn that nobody expected.
Yeah. Brilliant. No, Pete, thanks very much for that. I like going back in the memories because it's really fascinating to have someone who was there covering it. And Lewis, thanks for the detailed sort of just intake of how everyone was and the overtakes and just how everything played out. I love hearing the thoughts of you both. And yeah, that's it. Sepang 2015, it'll live on. It'll live on longer than I'm here on this earth, probably. So yeah, if you're in 2100, enjoy Sepang 15. Yeah, and just I will say, justice for the seagull as well at Phillip Island. Never got a mention in there. And Andrea Iannone, you're a lucky man because you got out of that really scot-free. And I think the Iannone angle is, yeah, fascinating too, how nothing really stuck to him throughout the whole 2 weeks. But yeah, if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, like. I'm not even going to say comment because I'm dreading reading these comments. Please, if you're going to, be sensible, but I can't control you all. And just, yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening.